I'm a team lead at Intellect, and if you want to find me online, Twitter, Intellect, and I attend to blog at continuousdeveloper.com. Sorry. So my talk this morning is around a library called edge.js. So just before I get into any of that, I just want to give you a little bit of background about what I do and where this fitted into my daily workflow. So I work at a financial institution, and part of our process every day is loading huge amounts of data from external systems into a database. These files come in the CSV, and it contains all sorts of investor type information. Currently, we're getting about 5 gigabytes of data a day, and we need that in the database quite early in the morning so we can start running other processes on it. So just quickly, the process that we follow, we initially used to have an it was gone blank. The SQL Server loader, that's it, SSIS, sorry. But it didn't work out so well for us, and we had some issues with quick deployments and that kind of thing. So before my time, the developers there decided to take a Node approach. And we used Node and Mongo, and it was a bit of a grunt type approach. I don't know if you've used grunt in your build tools. Grunt sort of works in it loads data from file, does something to it, writes the file again. And the next step reads from that file, does something, and dumps it again. So we had a similar approach. We'd read the CSV, convert it to JSON, dump it into Mongo. Then a separate script would kick in, read it from Mongo, do something to it, dump it to Mongo again. And then finally, we'd have another script that would read from that Mongo, convert it into a SQL insert statement, and write that into the database. So this process took us about 5 hours to load, and that was including running a whole bunch of stuff in parallel, which just wasn't fast enough for us. So we did a bit of a revamp, and we went with a more of a gulp type approach using node streams, where we read stuff once from disk, and we keep it in memory the whole time until we're ready to put it into the database. So it's using Node.js streams. I'm not going to go into how all of that works at the moment. I did write a blog post about it. You can go and have a look at that. This talk is this is just to give you a bit of context about where Edge fits in. So we have this pipeline of reading from the file, and the data flows through various steps in the pipeline until it's ready to be an insert statement. So we were still using insert statements in this case. And this process, using node streams, your process ends up being I/O bound. So you're limited by how fast you can read from disk or how fast you can write to the database. So we were still pretty slow. Still took us 2 hours to load everything. And we also had some other problems in that we were generating insert statements that needed to then be sent across a node library and then inserted into the database. And we had some restrictions on the length of those statements. We had some tables that had so many columns that we couldn't actually create one single insert statement, so that was also a bit of an issue. So the reason it was still quite slow was the database part. Like I mentioned, we had this very limited query length, and we had the SQL statement overhead. So this insert statement needs to be passed by SQL Server, that needs to figure out what it needs to do, it needs to check constraints, run any triggers, that kind of thing. And when you're trying to load millions of rows of data, you don't want to be doing that on every single insert. So luckily, the guys at Microsoft on the SQL Server team have thought about this a long time ago. And there's a tool called SQL Bulk Copy, or BCP. It is a command line utility. It doesn't have any of the overhead of statement compiling and checking all the constraints and that kind of thing. And it will allow you to then just write loads of data into the database in one go. And as an extra bonus for us, it allows us to use Active Directory authentication. I work in a big corporate. That's very important. They don't like having usernames and passwords floating around. It has to be AD authentication, which is a bit tricky to do in Node sometimes. Obviously, the only problem is this is a command line utility, and the command line utility works by you tell it, here's a file of data, dump this in the database. Now, we have this process where we read once from disk, run through a pipeline, and dump to file. We don't really want to dump to disk in between, read it from it, and then dump it into the database again. So that wasn't so helpful. There are a couple of Node libraries that supposedly support BCP, but all that they really do is wrap this little command line utility. So it wasn't so helpful. So I did a bit of research, and looking at other parts of our system that's primarily written in C#, I remembered there's a library in .NET called SQL Client, and that has some code that allows you to access BCP in memory without having to look at files. Obviously, we're using Node. That's .NET. How's this going to work? And I dug around a little bit and had a bit of research and figured out that it can work. And that's primarily what this talk is about. So just to summarize, we have a Node.js stack that's doing primarily all the work. We have a .NET library that we want to make use of. And we need some way to connect those two together. And that is what edge.js is. Edge.js has got nothing to do with the Edge browser, by the way. It's a separate thing. OK, so what exactly is edge.js? So edge.js allows you to call .NET code from within your Node process, and it's all in process. So it's not opening a socket or exposing services or web services, that kind of thing. It's completely all in the same process. It handles the call stack and the marshalling of data between the two different stacks, all for you. It also allows you to do communication in the other direction. So you could run .NET code and call into a Node or JavaScript code without having to install Node on a machine even. So where does this work? Well, I suppose if it's using .NET, you'd obviously think Windows. But with the recent changes to .NET that allow .NET to run on all platforms, this will work on all three major platforms, no problem. They support, they ship binaries that will work on all three of those. And if you want to have a look, that's an open source project on Git. If you look at the slides afterwards, you can, or just Google edge.js. OK, so I'm sure you just want to see what this actually looks like. So the simplest way to do it is you npm install edge, and you just write your C# completely inline on the JavaScript. So you'll see we call this edge.func and give it a function, and in a comment, we put the C#. That works pretty well, and then, well, I'll get to that now. You'll see then we now have a function called hello. That's just a plain old JavaScript function. We can call it wherever we want within the application, and it's going on forward now. You don't even have to know that it's running in .NET. This obviously will work nicely for simple, small chunks of code, but if you want anything that's a bit more complicated, or you may have multiple classes, or you want to pull in some third-party libraries, that's going to be a bit unwieldy. So the other way to do it is to actually just tell Edge, there is a .NET assembly in this location. Inside that assembly is this class, and I want to wrap this particular method. And it'll go and do all the work of pulling out that function for you. And then on the .NET side, there are a few funnies. You have to, because JavaScript and Node specifically is very asynchronous, the C# needs to comply with that. So you'll see the use of the async and await keywords. Myself, I'd never really used that in .NET. That was something I had to figure out and learn. But yeah, that's something to think about. And the other thing that's a bit of a gotcha is you can only pass in one single parameter, and the type that it comes through is dynamic. I don't know if anyone here has ever tried to work with dynamic in C#, but it's not nice. It's a pain. It can be done, and if you keep it relatively simple, it works okay. But if you try and do anything complicated, it can get very, very tricky. OK, so coming back to our solution that we had, I managed to wrap that SQL client library in a thin layer of sort of my own library that did some of the conversions between the dynamics and what BCP was expecting. So you'll see something to point out is every time I'm inserting data, I have to pass through some configuration as well. So the edge function itself can remember state from the previous time it was called, but you cannot on a single class call one configuration function and then call a different function to do the inserts. They maintain their own state. So there's no way for me to just say, OK, this is the database, and from now on I'm just going to give you the data. So every time I call it, I have to pass in the configuration for which database to insert the data into. I have to do a little bit of funnies around pulling that data out of the dynamic. Dynamic object, well, in JSON, if you have an object that, a property that is set to null, when that gets serialized, that property actually gets removed from the JSON object. And then when that comes through on the C# side, it no longer exists in the dynamic, and now you don't know that is null, it's just not there. So if you have some nullable types, there's some extra code required to handle that. And then it's just a matter of giving it this data and saying insert into the database. Yeah, and then on the .NET side, again, like I showed you before, we wrap this little method. And at the end of the pipeline, once you've gathered up a bunch of records, we pass it off to the function and ask it to dump it into the database. You'll notice as well, I didn't mention earlier, that when you call the function, you need to give it a callback. And that follows the standard node callback with the error first and the response. Because obviously your C# is now running asynchronously, you can call it and carry on while you wait for C# to do the heavy lifting. So just to compare, so on the .NET side, this is the kind of object that gets passed in. You can see, in my case, I was supporting AD authentication as well as username and password. And the way that I switched between the two is if the username wasn't set, it switched to AD, which is why it's null there, and which made it my life very difficult trying to figure out whether a property was null or just wasn't set. And then I give it the table, the database, and a row of JSON objects. I don't have to do anything specific. The only requirement is that it needs to match the ordering in the table, but that's more of a BCP issue than an edge.js issue. And then that's some of what the C# code looks like now trying to read from that dynamic object. Another issue I came across was because it's difficult to debug. Obviously, you're running say you've connected to the node process with your IDE, and now all of a sudden the context switches into .NET. Your IDE no longer knows what's going on over there, and it's difficult to step through that code. So I wrote quite a lot of automated tests on the C# side. The problem is when you create a dynamic object within a .NET environment, it's implemented in the background. I don't remember which one of these two options, but when it comes through via Edge, it's implemented in a different way. So the backing store is different, and to do reflection on those two is difficult to figure out what's null and what's not. So I had to jump through some hoops like that. But if the object you're passing through is a pretty standard JSON object with no nullable types, you shouldn't have any issues. So the result after all this work is that we are now able to write 1,000 records at a time. We settled on this number not because of a limitation on Edge or BCP or anything. That's more to do with the node streams. We had some back pressure issues, and this was sort of an optimal amount to dump at a time. And our load time went down to about 45 minutes to load that entire 5 gigs. And as a bonus, we now obviously had AD authentication as well. Okay, so I've mentioned these as I went along. I just want to summarize them, the challenges that I expected. So the async await. It's not asynchronous programming in JavaScript where you have a callback or promises or anything else like that. It's syntax keywords, async and await, and you've got to create tasks and that kind of thing. So if you haven't done that before, it can be confusing. Might not be for everybody. This single parameter of type dynamic. Once again, I mentioned the issues there. And this limited state. So it's not possible to keep too much state on the .NET side in between calls. And obviously, one other huge thing is trying to attach to that .NET process. If you want to maybe step through some code or inspect a variable, you end up writing console logs all over the place. Or like I had to do with tests, although that introduced other issues. There is one exception, though, which I haven't tried myself, but according to the edge.js website does work. If you're running your Node code within Visual Studio, so recent versions of Visual Studio support Node, they allow you to run and attach to a Node process, and you inline your C#, you'll be able to step through that C# within Visual Studio. So it will step into the comment and show you which line of code it's executing on, and you can inspect the values. So that's pretty cool. That's some magic there. Okay, so what else can Edge do? So I mentioned this Node into C#. It's actually not specific to C#. It's any of the core CLL languages, so F#, Visual Basic, if you really feel that way. And then also some sort of non-CLR stuff. There's support for PowerShell and for running T-SQL statements. So if you don't want to do bulk inserts, but you want to talk to a database, you can just give it an insert statement or some sort of SQL, and it will execute it against the database. It also has a plugin infrastructure. So there are some community plugins as well. There's support for Python at the moment. And there's quite good documentation on how to write your own plugins. There are libraries that allow you to do Windows authentication. So there's maybe some .NET libraries that call into native Windows APIs. There's some libraries that wrap that stuff for you. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also reverse this whole thing around and talk and call into JavaScript from .NET if you had that requirement. So you might think this is a very narrow use case. You can't see where you're going to do this. And it does add a fair amount of complexity to your application. But I have come across at least 2 other uses of it in the real world. Firstly, on our project, we have a Node.js and Angular sort of monitor application that keeps tabs on various parts of our system. And one of the applications that we use, our scheduling application, exposes a .NET API to get some information about what's running and what's failed and that kind of thing. And I've managed to get Node.js, edge.js working there so that I can talk to that API quite easily without having to expose WebSockets or anything like that. A team within Intellect who are now working on at a company called Incentivize, they have a complete Node.js stack and JavaScript front end, but they had a requirement to generate some Excel spreadsheets. And you can do that within Node. It's definitely possible. But there's also some very, very cool .NET libraries that give you some much more powerful options for generating that. And they've used edge.js to take the data from Node and just dump it into Excel with all the formatting and all that kind of thing. And then something I haven't tried myself, but I see a lot of discussion in the community. There's actually a Slack group where you can go on and talk about edge.js. The guy who wrote the library is very active there. Is getting it to work with Electron. I know there's a talk coming up next around Electron, and this will allow you to get even more access to the local sort of platform APIs that your JavaScript is running in. So I think that is all from my side. Are there any questions? Over there first, yeah?
Tell me, how big was the memory on the servers we were running the SSIS task on, like the server specs?
I'm not actually sure. So the SSIS stuff happened before I was there. The node process was already in place. But we had other issues with SSIS. It wasn't a performance issue necessarily. There was deployment times. At the time, we needed to make changes to the projections from the data to the database almost sometimes on a daily basis, and getting that into production was just slow. So Node gave us that option to iterate quickly and to deploy quickly. There was also some other network and infrastructure issues around it. Yeah.
Why I'm asking, in a previous project I was working on, for like 20 gig, we push it in like 20 minutes. So I think there's some configs we have to play with. Because SSIS is currently the world record holder in terms of data loading. Yeah. So I think there's probably some tricks.
That's possible. We had, it wasn't performance issue at the time. It was other issues that just made SSIS not possible. We had issues with authentication across the network and that kind of thing. To be honest, I've never worked in SSIS myself, and I enjoy this approach. We have quite a nice sort of pipeline where we can hook in at any point in that line while the data is moving through and make changes, and it's quite a lot of fun doing this. SSIS might be faster. It's definitely possible. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Isn't there some kind of a trick you can hack to keep the state in the .NET process running there?
Possibly. I haven't dug into it. From what it seems like is every time you call that edge.func method, it creates a context of some sort around that function, and the state seems to live within that. I haven't dug into it too much. I did the experimentation to check that it really doesn't keep the state. If you call a function and you set a variable in the class, and the next time you call that function, that state is still set. But if you then call from another function, it's not. Yeah, there may be some workarounds. I don't know. Great, thank you.